Well, this is an issue which at the Energy Transition Commission we've just produced a report on called Fossil Fuels in Transition. But our conclusion is that we do have to commit to a rapid phase down of the use of fossil fuels. Essentially, if we're to get to net zero by mid-century, you can either do that by continuing to use fossil fuels, but using carbon capture and storage or removals to offset it, or you can actually reduce fossil fuel use. We think that the reductions will have to come 85% from reducing actual fossil fuel use and only 15% from carbon capture and removal. So we are talking in our report about reducing the use of gas by between, say, 55 to 70% by 2050, coal 80 to 85%, and oil, this is the one we may really surprise people, by somewhere between 75 and 95% by 2050. And we do see a role for carbon capture and storage and removals, but we think it has to be a limited role. We don't think that it is prudent or credible to assume that oil or gas use can continue at the current level out into the mid-century, and that one can just offset that by huge amounts of carbon capture and storage. We think the optimal path will entail a very significant reduction in the actual use and therefore the supply of fossil fuels.
The critical minerals and materials will definitely play a central role in the energy transition, but securing enough supplies and at the right time is a huge challenge. How can this be addressed, ensuring it's also done in an environmentally friendly way?
Yes, if you look at what we have to do to get to net zero emissions, at the absolute core of it is a much bigger electricity system and the electrification of many sectors of the economy, in particular road transport. And that requires nickel or manganese or cobalt for batteries. It involves lithium. The electricity system will require copper. Wind turbines have rare earths like neodymium within them. Earlier this year at the Energy Transition Commission, we produced a report looking at all of those different minerals. There is no fundamental shortage of their existence in the earth. There are lots of those minerals out there, but two things are concerning. One, the pace at which we can develop the increased supply that we need. It is possible, but it requires a lot of investment. And, as you say, the actual local environmental impact of it, both the local environmental impact and the carbon intensity. Now, even at the current carbon intensity of mining and producing those minerals, it still makes a lot of sense to buy an electric car, not a fossil fuel car. You're still doing a lot of good for the climate. But it's very important for us to drive the supply chains of those critical minerals down towards net zero. For instance, by making sure that all these big nickel refineries that are being built in Indonesia are powered by renewable energy rather than coal energy. And I think what we're going to see increasingly are regulations which require that electric vehicles have an account of where the battery came from, and battery producers can say where the minerals came from, and the mineral producer can say how much carbon was used in producing it. We're going to end up with, and we should end up with, very tightly defined carbon cycle analysis, and that will help us make sure that these critical minerals are produced in an environmentally sound fashion.
Well, this raises the question of, carbon accounting and the standardization of that accounting, which we're still far off from. But let me move on to the financing costs and the expectations of higher for longer interest rates. How do you foresee this affecting renewable energy, given that this sector is very sensitive to capital costs and interest rates?
Yes, you're right. Renewable energy is particularly sensitive to capital costs because, unlike a fossil fuel plant like a gas turbine, in the case of renewables, there's almost no operating cost. Once you've built it, you get the electricity at zero marginal cost, but all the cost is in the capital up front. And that means that the cost of capital is hugely important. Now, we don't know what's going to happen to interest rates, but I think we are probably in an environment where we should anticipate that real interest rates will stay somewhat higher for some period of time than they were before 2020. And that does increase the levelized cost of renewables. Now, In the case of solar, I think the cost reductions which we are now seeing in the actual cost of solar PV panels is so fast that it will overwhelm that. So for instance, Aqua Power, I know in Saudi Arabia about 2 years ago won a solar PV auction at just $10.40 per megawatt hour, 1 cent per kilowatt hour. You wouldn't see that this year because of the higher cost of capital, but I think you'll see it in 3 or 4 years' time simply because the panels will get so cheap. So the long-term trends of cost reduction in the renewable technologies are still there, but there is a higher cost of capital, and that has increased the cost at least for a period of time. It has reduced, it has been a temporary setback to what I think will still be a long-term reducing cost trend.
But is that the same thing what's happening with the wind energy, specifically in offshore?
Wind is challenged, and offshore wind challenged to a greater extent than solar, though I still think the long-term trends are there, and the giveaway in this respect is China, which is installing huge amounts of offshore wind this year, and where the cost of turbines are continuing to come down. So that tells us that the technological trends are still there. But what we've had in Northwest Europe, in particular in the North Sea and in the US, is various contracts getting cancelled. You've seen some big write-offs. What occurred there is some people entered into contracts which were not index linked, inflation index linked, at a time where they just assumed that inflation would be 2% forever. And those contracts also allowed them to get out of the contract with very little penalties. Well, that was a formula for people for overbidding, but then pulling out. We also had an increase in the cost of steel, but that has reversed. We also had some countries getting a little bit greedy and trying to put in maximum prices within auctions which were too tight, and in the UK that we therefore saw an auction round where there were no offshore wind bids. I think these are important challenges for us to deal with, as well as the challenges of the speed at which you can connect to the grid and planning and permitting. But I think there are actions that we can take which will put that crucial technology, particularly crucial technology in Europe, back on the path it was on before.